The king won by running away. The enemy thought they were winning because the Mongols were running. At first it looked obvious. Across the open steppe the eastern riders turned their horses away, loosened their formation, and streamed back toward the horizon as if fear had finally entered them. Dust rose behind their hooves. A few arrows were loosed backward without much aim. A handful of men seemed to lag. To the warriors chasing them, it looked like the first crack in an army that had traveled too far from home. The Rus princes and their Cuman allies had come south with banners, wagons, priests, heavy horses, household retainers, and pride. They had been told that strange horsemen from the east had crossed mountains, defeated tribes, and appeared on the edge of the grasslands like smoke after a distant fire. But the warriors of the Rus were not villagers hiding behind doors. They were princes' men, armored riders, experienced fighters, and steppe allies who understood cavalry war. When they saw the Mongols retreat, many believed the mystery had ended. The invaders were fast, yes, dangerous perhaps, but now they were running. That belief became the first chain around their necks. The road to the Kalka River did not begin with a single battle. It began with a Mongol reconnaissance so vast that it looked like an invasion, and an invasion so mobile that it looked like a raid. After the fall of the Khwarezmian Empire, two of Genghis Khan's most capable commanders, Jebe and Subutai, drove west with a force hardened by long campaigning. They were not wandering blindly. They gathered information as they moved. River crossings, grazing ground, tribal rivalries, the distance between towns, the habits of armies, the weight of local cavalry, the temper of princes, the value of promises, and the cost of betrayal. They crossed through the Caucasus and struck powers that had never expected the war of the Far East to arrive at their doors. The Alans, Circassians, Kipchaks, Cumans, and others found that these riders did not fight like raiders looking only for plunder. The Mongols could negotiate, divide enemies, strike suddenly, vanish before a counterattack, and return when anger had replaced caution. They fought with bows, horses, discipline, and patience. Most importantly, they fought with distance. To men used to deciding battle in a violent meeting of bodies, the Mongol way of war could feel like trying to punch a storm. The Cumans understood enough to be frightened. They were steppe people themselves. They knew the language of mounted movement, the danger of loose riders pretending weakness, and the cruelty of a retreat that was not a retreat. Their Khan, Khotan, looked west toward the Rus lands and asked for help. He did not go as a beggar without arguments. He offered warnings, kinship, marriage ties, and the simple truth that the eastern riders would not stop at the first people they defeated. If the Rus princes waited until the Mongols arrived alone at their own borders, they might face them without allies. The princes listened, but they did not listen as one mind. The Rus world was not a single clenched fist. It was a collection of principalities, rival courts, old grudges, personal ambitions, and fragile alliances. A campaign could be agreed upon without every commander trusting the man beside him. Mstislav Mstislavich of Galich, later remembered as Mstislav the Bold, favored action. Mstislav III of Kiev brought weight and status. Other princes and commanders joined with different expectations: revenge, defense, glory, fear, loyalty to allies, and fear of being blamed if they stayed home. When the Allied army gathered near the lower Dnieper, it looked powerful in the way armies often look powerful before the marching begins. Campfires multiplied at night, horses grazed in wide patches, wagons carried provisions, tents, tools, spare weapons, cooking pots, and the heavy necessities of men who did not expect to live entirely off the saddle. Priests carried icons and blessings. Cuman scouts moved ahead, restless and anxious. The Rus warriors prepared for a campaign on the open steppe, but many still imagined that the enemy would eventually have to stop and fight like a normal army. Then Mongol envoys came. They did not arrive with the posture of defeated men. They came with words calculated to test the alliance. They told the Rus that the Mongols had no quarrel with them, that their true enemies were the Cumans, and that there was no need for Rus blood to be spilled for steppe allies. Such messages were never only messages. They were knives searching for seams. If the Rus abandoned the Cumans, the Mongols could defeat the steppe tribes separately. If the Rus killed the envoys, they would cross a line that Mongol custom treated as unforgivable. If the princes argued over the message, delay itself would reveal weakness. The envoys were killed. After that, the campaign no longer felt like a distant border matter. It had become personal, religious, political, and irreversible. More envoys came later. warning that since the Rus had killed messengers, they had chosen war. The warning did not stop the army. It sharpened the pride of men, who believed that the eastern riders were trying to frighten them because they did not dare stand. The first clash seemed to confirm that confidence. A Mongol rear guard was caught and destroyed. Its commander Hamabek was reportedly captured and killed. To the allied army, this looked like proof that the enemy could be beaten. The Mongols had left men behind. Those men had died. Therefore, the main force must be vulnerable. Warriors who had doubted the campaign now heard the language of victory in the camp. Men cleaned weapons. Riders boasted. The Cumans, desperate to reclaim what had been lost, urged pursuit. The Rus princes, eager not to let rivals claim the glory alone, pushed forward. But a rearguard can be a shield, a sacrifice, or bait. Jebe and Subutai did not need their pursuers to be fools. They needed them to be human. They needed anger to outrun caution, success to breed impatience, and alliance politics to break the rhythm of command. A man chasing a defeated enemy rides differently from a man entering unknown danger. He looks ahead, not sideways. He eats badly because he expects soon to finish the work. He waters his horse too late. He ignores the slower wagons. He resents any commander who tells him to halt. The Mongols withdrew eastward across the grasslands. They did not flee in a mob. Their movement had layers. Scouts watched the pursuers. Rear elements showed themselves just enough to keep the chase alive. Riders exchanged horses to preserve speed. Signals moved by messenger and visual cue. Small groups could appear vulnerable, then vanish beyond low ridges. The line between panic and plan was kept deliberately thin, because the pursuers had to believe what their eyes wanted to see. For the Allied army, the first day of pursuit still felt like momentum. The Mongols were ahead. The steppe stretched open. The enemy left dust tracks and occasional stragglers. The mounted men pressed forward. Foot soldiers and wagons followed as best they could. Cuman riders, more accustomed to the steppe, ranged ahead with excitement and worry mixed together. They had seen this kind of trick before, but the taste of revenge made restraint difficult. Behind them, the Rus contingents began to lengthen. By the second day, distance started doing work that no sword had done yet. Horses needed water, men needed sleep, camp order became rougher. Units that had marched together near the Dnieper now arrived at stopping points at different hours. A prince who halted early looked cautious or weak. A prince who advanced too far risked isolation, but might seize the honor of first battle. Messengers rode between groups carrying requests, complaints, rumors, and accusations. No single command voice could easily pull the entire army into one disciplined body. By the third day, dust became part of the war. A rider at the front could not see what had happened far behind him. A commander in the rear heard reports already half dead by the time they arrived. The Mongols remained visible enough to invite pursuit but distant enough to deny closure. Sometimes they seemed to slow. Sometimes they disappeared over a rise, forcing the pursuers to hurry before losing them. Sometimes a few riders turned and shot arrows, a stinging insult that made men spur forward in anger. Each small decision favored the trap. Do not stop now, the enemy is close. Do not wait for the wagons. They will catch up. Do not let another prince take the victory. Do not give the Mongols time to escape. Do not let the Cumans say the Rus were afraid. Do not let caution steal glory at the last moment. The army was no longer simply moving across the steppe. It was being stretched by pride. On the Mongol side, the retreat was a labor of discipline. Horses had to be rotated. Units had to avoid accidental battle before the chosen ground. Scouts had to measure the separation between enemy groups. Commanders had to know when to show weakness and when to disappear. Too much speed and the pursuers might stop. Too little speed and the Mongols might be forced into a fight before the trap had matured. The feigned retreat was not cowardice. It was a long performance in which one wrong movement could turn theater into disaster. Jebe had the reputation of a blade, fast, direct, hard to hold. Subutai had the mind of a man who could see battles as systems rather than moments. Together they understood that the Allied army's size could be made useless if its parts arrived separately. The Rus did not have to be annihilated all at once. First they had to be divided by distance. Then the forward troops had to be struck before the rear could properly support them. Then confusion had to flow backward faster than orders could move forward. The pursuit continued for days. The landscape offered few clear markers to men unfamiliar with every fold of the grasslands. Streams, low hills, shallow valleys, and patches of brush became temporary stages of hope and frustration. At one halt, men argued over whether the Mongols were exhausted. At another, scouts reported that the enemy had abandoned fires. Farther ahead, Cuman riders saw signs that could mean panic or deliberate luring. Behind them, Rus contingents tightened girths, cursed the dust, and wondered why victory kept moving away. The farther they rode, the more the army's beginning and end became different worlds. Men near the front heard fresh rumors of enemy weakness. Men in the center knew only that the pace had become punishing. Men in the rear saw broken equipment, sick horses and stragglers. A warrior who had left the Dnieper inside a proud host now found himself among smaller clusters of men following tracks across land that seemed to give nothing back. Water became a commander too. On the steppe, thirst does not need to kill immediately to change behavior. It makes men impatient. It makes officers choose speed over order. It makes horses less responsive. It turns a planned march into a search. The Mongols, with remounts and better steppe rhythm, could manage movement with a flexibility their pursuers struggled to match. The Allied force still had strength, but strength was being spent before battle. At last the Mongols stopped near the Kalka River. The moment was not announced with trumpets. The retreat simply ended. Riders who had spent days showing their backs now turned their horses. Units that had seemed loose began to arrange themselves. Standards appeared. Horse archers spread where they could move. Heavier Mongol troops held where needed. The place had been chosen not because it was magical, but because timing, distance, terrain, and enemy disorder had finally aligned. The pursuers had been pulled far enough. Their columns were uneven. Their commanders were not unified. Their confidence had become brittle. Mstislav the Bold and the Cumans were among those nearest the front. They did not wait for every Rus force to assemble. That decision carried the entire tragedy inside it. Waiting might allow the enemy to escape again. Waiting might let rivals claim caution as wisdom. Waiting might lose the battle before it began. So the forward elements attacked. For a brief moment, battle gave them what pursuit had promised: contact. Hooves struck earth, men shouted, banners leaned into motion. The Cumans moved with step skill, firing and maneuvering, but now they were facing riders who had spent their lives turning movement into calculation. The Rus warriors pressed in with heavier force, expecting that close combat would settle what the long chase had delayed. The Mongol arrows came first as irritation, then as weather, then as structure. Horse archers did not need to stand still and trade blows. They could pull men out of shape, punish exposed horses, hit flanks, and make every attempt at formation more difficult. A warrior raising his shield against one angle opened himself to another. Horses wounded under armored men became collapsing obstacles. Units that tried to advance found the enemy giving ground just enough to preserve killing distance. Then pressure struck from the sides. The Allied front had expected a retreating enemy forced to fight. Instead it met an army opening like a gate and closing like jaws. Mongol wings moved against the flanks. Arrows cut into horses and men. The Cumans, who had carried urgency into the pursuit, began to break under the shock. Their retreat smashed into Rus formations behind them. A man in the second line saw allies coming back too fast and did not know whether to open space, hold position, or brace for impact. In that hesitation, order suffered. The battlefield filled with wrong information. Some believed the Cumans had betrayed them. Some believed the Mongols were everywhere. Some heard commands that applied to units no longer beside them. Dust hid distances. Horses without riders ran through gaps. Men who had chased for days now needed clear leadership in minutes, and the alliance could not provide it quickly enough. The Mongols did not have to crush every group at once. They broke rhythm first. A Rus detachment advanced and found its flank gone. Another tried to form around a banner but was showered by arrows before it could stabilize. A mounted retinue charged toward a visible knot of enemies, only to have the target dissolve and fresh arrows strike from another angle. The steppe, which had seemed empty during the chase, now felt crowded with threats. The forward army began to collapse. Collapse in battle is rarely clean. It is not a single moment when everyone decides to flee. It is a sequence of local disasters that reach each other. A prince's guard is cut off. A horse falls and blocks a path. A banner disappears. A rumor says the left wing is gone. Men move backward to gain space and are seen as running. Others run because they see men moving backward. A commander orders a rally, but the men who need to hear it are already beyond his voice. Mstislav the Bold escaped, but many did not. The battle rolled over the forward elements, and then reached those still trying to understand what had happened. Farther back, Mstislav of Kiev and his men withdrew into a fortified camp. Wagons, shields, and available materials became a rough defensive ring. There the war changed shape again. The chase was over, the open battle had passed, now came endurance. For 3 days the camp held out. Inside, men listened to the sounds beyond the defenses. The Mongols did not need to spend lives recklessly. They could surround, watch, pressure, and wait. The defenders had limited food, limited water, wounded men, and the knowledge that the field outside belonged to the enemy. Every hour made the earlier pursuit seem more distant and more foolish. Men who had ridden south expecting a decisive victory now sat behind improvised barriers, counting what remained. Negotiation arrived wearing the face of survival. The defenders were promised safe conduct if they surrendered. Exhaustion makes promises heavier. Hunger gives words a different sound. A commander responsible for men trapped in a shrinking circle must choose between dying where he stands and trusting an enemy whose customs he does not understand. Mstislav of Kiev accepted surrender. The promise did not save them. The Mongols slaughtered many of the surrendered men. According to the grim tradition preserved in later accounts, captured princes were placed beneath boards, while the victors feasted above, killing them without spilling noble blood onto the ground. Whether every detail hardened in the telling or not, the meaning was clear enough to those who heard it. The campaign had ended not with ransom, honor, or a negotiated defeat, but with humiliation designed to be remembered. When the killing ended, the steppe did not look like a place of grand strategy. It looked like abandoned equipment, riderless horses, broken wagons, scattered shields, and men searching among bodies for names. The great Allied host that had seemed so formidable at the Dnieper had been divided, stretched, struck, and dismantled. Some survivors fled back toward Ruslands carrying fragments of the disaster. Others never returned. The numbers would be argued by chroniclers, but the political wound needed no exact count. Princes were dead. Retinues were gone. Confidence had been broken in a place many people back home could barely locate. The Mongols did not stay to occupy the Ruslands then. That made the victory even harder to understand. They had appeared, destroyed a coalition, gathered knowledge, and moved away. To some in the West, it may have seemed like a terrible storm that had passed. But Jebe and Subutai had not merely won a battle. They had measured roads, enemies, command habits, rivers, and reaction times. They had learned how Rus princes cooperated, and how they failed to cooperate. They had proven that a large allied army could be tempted into disorder if its leaders did not share one command mind. The lesson would matter later. For the men who survived Kalka, the memory was not a lesson in abstract tactics. It was the sight of a retreat that kept retreating until pursuit became exhaustion. It was the anger of seeing enemies always just ahead. It was the embarrassment of urging tired horses forward, because turning back felt like cowardice. It was the shock when the horizon suddenly produced not fugitives but an arranged army. It was the sound of Cuman horses breaking backward into Rus lines. It was the discovery that victory, chased too greedily, can become terrain chosen by someone else. That is why the feigned retreat was so cruel. It did not simply deceive the eyes. It recruited the enemy's virtues against him. Courage became impatience. Aggression became overextension. Honor became refusal to pause. Rivalry became speed. Confidence became blindness. Every day of pursuit added another invisible cut, and by the time the Mongols turned, the battle had already been half won. Years later, when larger Mongol armies returned to Eastern Europe, the memory of earlier contact could not protect every city, but it gave warning to those willing to understand it. The riders from the east were not just fast. They were organized at a scale their enemies often misread. They could retreat without losing control, scatter without dissolving, negotiate without weakness, and kill without hurrying. Their greatest weapon was not always the bow, the horse, or the sword. Sometimes it was the patience to let an enemy defeat his own formation before the first decisive charge. The return north was not a triumphant march but a scattering of damaged stories. A survivor might reach a river crossing without the lord who had led him there. Another might bring back a horse with an empty saddle, and no clear account of where its rider had fallen. In towns and wooden halls, families waited for banners that did not appear. The absence of men became the first report. Then came the details: the long chase, the dust, the sudden turn, the broken Cumans, the camp, the surrender, the dead princes. Each teller remembered a different fragment. and the fragments did not fit neatly together, because the defeat itself had been designed to prevent a single understanding while it happened. For the Mongols, the aftermath was practical. Dead enemies were not the end of the work. Horses had to be gathered, scouts had to be sent, prisoners had to be questioned, routes had to be remembered. The commanders had to decide what the battle had taught them about the western lands, and what information should be carried back across the steppe. Victory was not treated as a final scene. It was folded into the next campaign, the next map, the next calculation of how far rivers lay from cities, and how quickly proud men could be made to ride apart. At Kalka the trap closed because men believed the simplest explanation: the enemy was afraid. But on the evening after the battle, as fires burned low and the Mongol commanders prepared to move again, the truth lay across the grass in broken lines. The road behind the Allied army had become longer than its discipline. The riverbank held the cost of every impatient mile. Far from the courts where the campaign had been argued, the steppe kept the final evidence: hoofprints leading east, empty wagons sinking into dust, and a silence where a pursuing army had once mistaken motion for victory.